25 million Americans check a box on the census that says Irish. Fewer than 1 million check a box that says Scots-Irish. And somewhere in between those two numbers is a population of roughly 20 million people whose ancestry has been badly mislabeled for over 200 years, hiding inside the vaguest ethnic category on every DNA test ever sold. If your family tree runs through the hollows of eastern Kentucky, southern West Virginia, southwestern Virginia, or East Tennessee, your consumer DNA result probably told you that you're British or Irish or Scottish. That answer isn't wrong. It's just not finished. And by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly which corner of Europe your ancestors actually left, why they left it, and why the label your test gave you has been quietly hiding the real story for 2 centuries. For most of American history, the story of Appalachia has been told in one sentence. Scots-Irish settlers came down from Pennsylvania, moved into the mountains, and stayed there. That sentence isn't false, but it compresses 4 distinct migrations, 3 different countries, and one of the strangest episodes in British history into a single word that tells you almost nothing about where your ancestors actually stood 250 years ago, what they were running from, or what happened to them once they arrived. Genetic genealogy over the last 15 years has started to pull that single sentence apart, and what it reveals is more specific, more traceable, and honestly more interesting than the shorthand ever let on. To understand why the Appalachian gene pool looks the way it does today, you first need to understand something about the terrain itself. Central Appalachia is not gently rolling countryside. It is a landscape of narrow creek valleys called hollows, boxed in by steep ridgelines that made large-scale transportation almost impossible until the railroads followed the coal industry in the final decades of the 1800s. Families who settled a hollow in the late 1700s tended to stay in that hollow. They farmed the narrow strip of flat land along the creek bottom, married into the family in the next hollow over, and did that again for 6, 7, 8 generations. Geneticists call this pattern endogamy, meaning marriage within a limited, closed population, and it is extremely common in isolated pre-industrial societies around the world. What makes Central Appalachia notable is not that endogamy happened, but how long it lasted and how well it was preserved by the terrain. When a population marries within itself for 2 centuries in a place that outsiders rarely reached, the genetic signature of the founding settlers doesn't blend into the wider American population. It stays legible. Surnames that appear on the Kentucky tax rolls of 1800 are still the dominant surnames in the same counties 200 years later, and that continuity in the paper record is mirrored in the DNA. Genetic genealogists working with Y chromosome and autosomal data from the region, along with the Ancestry DNA Genetic Communities Project, which analyzes shared DNA segments across hundreds of thousands of customers to identify historically isolated populations, have consistently found that Central Appalachian ancestry doesn't cluster neatly with the broader Anglo-American population found in New England or the Mid-Atlantic. It forms its own recognizable cluster, one that researchers have linked most strongly not to England in general, but to a specific and often overlooked corner of the British Isles, the country on either side of the border between England and Scotland. The reason isolation produces a readable signal instead of just a smaller, quieter version of the surrounding population comes down to a basic principle of population genetics. In a large, mobile population, rare genetic variants tend to dilute over time as people marry, outward and mix with unrelated groups. In a small, closed population, the opposite happens. Variants that might otherwise fade instead become concentrated, simply because there are only so many founding families to draw from, and each subsequent generation is choosing partners from that same limited pool. This is the same underlying mechanism responsible for elevated rates of certain hereditary conditions in other well-documented endogamous populations, from Ashkenazi Jewish communities to the Amish and Mennonite communities descended from the Swiss Anabaptist migration. Isolation is not inherently good or bad for a population's health outcomes, but it is extremely good for a geneticist trying to trace where a population came from, because it keeps the original signal from being smoothed away by later mixing. Central Appalachia, sealed off from major transportation routes until the coal boom of the 1880s brought railroads into the coalfield counties, is one of the clearest examples of this effect anywhere in the eastern United States. To understand what that border actually produced, you need to go back to a period of British history that rarely makes it into American classrooms. From roughly the late 13th century to the start of the 17th, the frontier between England and Scotland was one of the most violently unstable regions in Western Europe, not because of full-scale war between the two crowns, though that happened too, but because of a lower, more constant kind of violence carried out by families against families. The people who lived in that borderland were known as reivers, from an Old English word meaning to rob or plunder. They rustled cattle, burned farmsteads, and kidnapped for ransom in raids that could involve anywhere from a handful of riders to, according to some historical accounts, sever, 1,000. Neither the English crown nor the Scottish crown fully claimed them. Both treated the border as a separate administrative headache, governed loosely through a system of wardens and march law that operated alongside, and often instead of, the ordinary legal systems of both kingdoms. The definitive modern account of this period is the historian George MacDonald Fraser's 1971 book, The Steel Bonnets, which remains the standard reference on the reaving families. Fraser catalogued dozens of what were called riding surnames, the family names most associated with border raiding on both the Scottish and English sides: Armstrong, Elliot, Graham, Bell, Scott, Kerr, Nixon, Johnstone, Robson, Charlton. These are not names scattered evenly across the United Kingdom. They cluster specifically along the old border counties of Cumberland, Northumberland, Roxburghshire, and Dumfriesshire, and genealogists have long noted that the same names appear at unusually high frequency in the historical population of Appalachia. That is not folklore. It is a documented pattern, and it points directly at the border country as one of the major source populations for the region, alongside the Scottish lowlands and northern England more broadly. The Reavers did not travel from the border directly to America. They took a detour first, and that detour explains a lot about who actually arrived at the Appalachian frontier a century later. By the early 1600s, the union of the English and Scottish crowns under James I had made the semi-lawless border an embarrassment rather than a useful buffer zone. James's solution was resettlement. Beginning in 1610, the Crown organized the plantation of Ulster, moving loyal Protestant settlers disproportionately drawn from the Scottish lowlands and the English border. Counties, into the northern Irish province of Ulster, land that had recently been confiscated from Gaelic Irish clans after a failed rebellion. The stated purpose was to secure a rebellious province with a reliably Protestant population. The practical effect for the border families in particular was relocation to somewhere the Crown considered safely far from Carlisle and Edinburgh. This is where the genetic record and the historical record line up cleanly. In 2017, a team led by geneticist Dr. Edmund Gilbert at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland published the Irish DNA Atlas, a fine-scale genetic map built from Irish individuals with 4 generations of documented ancestry in defined regions. The study found clear, geographically structured genetic clusters across Ireland, and when British populations were added to the comparison, it revealed a close genetic relationship between Northern Irish populations and Scottish populations that reflects the historical plantation migrations of the 16th and 17th centuries. A related study of the genetic landscape of Scotland, produced in collaboration with the University of Edinburgh, reached a similar conclusion from the other direction. The population that became known as the Ulster Scots was not a blend of Irish and British ancestry in any deep sense. It was a transplanted lowland Scottish and northern English population that kept its genetic continuity largely intact across the Irish Sea. The move changed where these families lived. It did not meaningfully change who they were, genetically speaking. What pushed the Ulster Scots out of Ireland and toward American ports is well documented and doesn't require speculation. Presbyterian settlers in Ulster faced real legal and religious disadvantages under an Anglican establishment that did not fully recognize their church, along with punishing trade restrictions on Irish wool and linen that damaged the local economy, and a series of poor harvests in the 1710s that pushed already thin margins into crisis. Between 1717 and the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775, roughly 250,000 people left Ulster for the American colonies, the vast majority sailing out of the port of Belfast and landing at Philadelphia. It's worth being precise about that number, since it is sometimes inflated in popular retellings. 250,000 people across nearly 60 years was still one of the largest single migrations to colonial America. But it happened in waves, not all at once, and it overlapped with major German migration through the same port during the same decades. Philadelphia in the early 1700s was controlled by an established Quaker elite with limited appetite for the crowds of Ulster Presbyterian and German Protestant migrants arriving with little capital and no political connections. Colonial authorities actively encouraged both groups to move onward, and they did following the Great Wagon Road, sometimes called the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road, an 800-mile route that ran south from Pennsylvania through the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia and into the North Carolina backcountry. The road itself followed an older path, the Great Warriors Path, long used by Iroquois traveling parties moving south to trade or raid, before colonial land agreements and later outright settlement converted it into the primary highway of the southern backcountry. As land filled up along the road, the Scots-Irish in particular pushed further west into the mountains, where creek bottom land was still available and no one else particularly wanted it. It's worth noting that settlement along the Wagon Road was not evenly mixed. Contemporary observers described Scots-Irish and German families frequently taking up land on opposite sides of the same river valley, forming distinct neighboring communities, rather than blending into a single, undifferentiated frontier population. A pattern that historians and genealogists can still trace today through the religious denomination of old church records. Presbyterian on one side of a given valley, Lutheran or German Reformed on the other. By the outbreak of the Revolution, this migration pattern had put the core Ulster Scots population of central Appalachia largely in place. And it explains why the region's dominant genetic and surname signal traces back to the Scottish lowlands, the English border counties, and Ulster, rather than to southern England or the aristocratic families associated with the early tidewater colonies. Consumer DNA tests are not built to make this distinction visible, and it's worth understanding exactly why. Because it isn't a flaw so much as a limitation of the underlying science. Companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe estimate your ethnicity by comparing your DNA to reference panels built from people with well-documented ancestry in a specific region. The problem is that lowland Scots, English border families, and Ulster Scots are, genetically speaking, extremely close to one another because they were, until very recently in genetic terms, the same population separated only by which side of a body of water they happen to live on. Most consumer tests simply don't have the reference resolution to cleanly separate those groups, so they get folded into a broader category like Scottish, or England and Northwestern Europe, or Ireland and Scotland. Your result is not incorrect. It is describing a real ancestral signal at a resolution too coarse to show you the border country specifically. If you want a finer-grained answer, the tool that gets you there is Y chromosome testing, available as an add-on through services like Family Tree DNA, and at a shallower level, through 23andMe's paternal haplogroup results. This only traces your direct paternal line, father to father to father, so it's one thread out of thousands in your family tree. But it's a thread that can be read with real geographic precision. 2 Y chromosome haplogroups dominate among men with deep Appalachian roots. The first, RU106, is common across the eastern half of England, the Netherlands, and northwestern Germany, and generally reflects descent from populations associated with the Anglo-Saxon and broader Germanic migrations into Britain. The second, RL21, is the dominant Celtic faux, Atlantic signal found at high frequency in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall. Research on Y chromosome distribution in Scotland and Ulster has found that a specific L21 subclade reaches some of its highest frequencies in western Scotland and along the Ulster coast, which lines up with the historical migration route reasonably well. Whichever haplogroup a specific family carries, the point is the same. It's a more geographically precise fingerprint than a broad ethnicity estimate, though it's important to be honest about its limits too. A haplogroup traces one lineage among thousands of ancestors, and it can't tell you anything about the rest of your family tree. The Ulster Scots were the largest single stream feeding into Appalachian ancestry, but they were not the only one. And treating the region as ethnically uniform erases a real and well-documented second population. Alongside the Scots-Irish moving down the Great Wagon Road came large numbers of German-speaking settlers, later known collectively and somewhat inaccurately as the Pennsylvania Dutch. The name is a corruption of Deutsch, the German word for German, not a reference to the Netherlands. Historical demographic work, including research by the historian Marianne Walkick, estimates that roughly 80,000 German-speaking migrants arrived in Pennsylvania through the port of Philadelphia between 1710 and 1770, with the heaviest wave landing between 1749 and 1755. The largest share of this migration came from the Rhineland-Palatinate, a region repeatedly devastated by the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, and then by the wars of Louis XIV into the early 18th, which left entire villages destroyed and pushed survivors toward emigration as one of the only remaining options. Smaller but genetically distinct streams came from the Swiss cantons, particularly Bern and Zurich, forming the ancestral core of the Amish and Mennonite communities, and from the Alsace-Baden corridor along the Upper Rhine, a border region whose descendants often stopped identifying as German after Alsace became politically French, even though the ancestry itself didn't go anywhere. By the mid-1700s, roughly 1 in 10 colonial Americans spoke German as a first language, a scale of presence significant enough that Benjamin Franklin reportedly worried, in writing, about whether Pennsylvania would remain culturally English at all. These German families followed the same Great Wagon Road south into Virginia's Shenandoah Valley and beyond, forming what's still referred to today as the Valley Germans or Shenandoah Deutsch. They tended to settle the richer valley farmland rather than pushing as far into the highest, most isolated hollows, which is part of why the German genetic and cultural signal in Appalachia is real, substantial, and historically documented, but generally less concentrated than the Scots-Irish signal in the deepest parts of the coalfield counties of eastern Kentucky and southern West Virginia specifically. It's a meaningfully different distribution, not a competing myth, and it shows up clearly in surnames and church records, Lutheran and Reformed congregations, alongside the Scots-Irish Presbyterian ones, and in cultural markers like barn architecture and folk art that persisted for generations in the valley corridors. There's a third, smaller and frequently overlooked component as well, tied to a different door of entry entirely. Long before the Ulster Scots came down the Great Wagon Road in the 1730s and 1740s, the tidewater colonies of Virginia and Maryland had already absorbed a substantial population of indentured English servants, many drawn from London and from southwestern port cities like Bristol, Plymouth, and Exeter. Historical estimates place the total number of indentured servants brought to the Chesapeake colonies across the 17th century in the range of well over 100,000. When their terms of service expired, most had no realistic path to owning tidewater land, which was already claimed by the planter elite, so they moved west into the Virginia Piedmont, and from there toward the eastern edge of the mountains. By the time the main Scots-Irish migration arrived, this earlier West Country English population was already established in the foothills, which is part of why genetic analysis of the region sometimes picks up a secondary cluster linked to southwestern England alongside the dominant border and lowland Scottish signal. A smaller Welsh migration, concentrated but never large in absolute numbers, followed a similar path and left a distinct, still detectable genetic marker in parts of eastern Kentucky and western North Carolina, a reminder that even a modest founding population can remain genetically visible for many generations in a region defined by limited outside migration.